of those boards. We're really excited. We have 2 guest speakers that we flew up for this event. Scott Savage, who you heard this morning and we'll hear again this afternoon, and Pat. So give Pat a warm welcome.
All right, so I'm going to talk to you about the long-range receiver, what it is, how we've been using it, and how we're developing a training program down in Juneau. So first, just like to thank a few people. First, Juneau Mountain Rescue for allowing me the opportunity to train with this device, learn this device, and funding for training and everything else that we do. Mike Janes, who's in the audience back there, for all his guidance and mentorship and sharing the long-range receiver with search and rescue. So I'll get into who owns it and everything else, but AEL&P really truly owns this device. Brian Davies with Eagle Crest Ski Patrol has been a mentor along the way, and when these search and rescue calls come in, he's graciously let me leave my day job and go help and help those that are in need. Alaska State Troopers, obviously they fund all search and rescue in the state and have been supportive in all these training missions, and Coastal Helicopters for their time, donating flight time, donating time for the pilots in the hangar to help us test this device, figure out how it truly works, how we can use it, and how we can use it when it's truly time to use it. So this is what it looks like when it's not totally connected to the helicopter. This is right out of the bag in storage. And what this device is, it's a helicopter-based 457 kilohertz Avalanche transceiver with an omnidirectional antenna. So what that truly means, it's basically an analog beacon search with a helicopter. It's temporarily installed on a helicopter to perform avalanche rescue or other technical rescue in areas deemed too dangerous or too laborious to actually do that on the ground. And we'll get into why that's important. And we'll get into range checks and everything else. But something to think about as I go through this, it's capable of a 70 to 100 meter range with the device. Now, it's an omnidirectional antenna, which is a little different than traditional avalanche transceivers, and that allows us 360-degree signal detection below the helicopter. It can be used in both slide paths or in crevasses, gorge, areas that we can't access on foot or they're too dangerous to access on foot. Key emphasis here is it only works if the person you're searching for is wearing an avalanche transceiver and it's transmitting. This doesn't do you any good if they're not wearing a transceiver. So we'll get into that here in a little bit as well. And we can use it on multiple different types of aircraft. We usually use A-Stars down in Juneau. We have used Hughes 500s and other aircrafts, but it is not aircraft specific. Some of the settings on it are aircraft specific, but we'll get into that too. So let's talk about some advantages, disadvantages of the long-range receiver. We're able to search areas, large areas, quickly and efficiently with a minimal amount of resources. We can also do this from the air, so we're limiting the exposure of our resources on the ground. We're not putting somebody in the slide path or on the debris pile, or if there's any hang fire, we're not putting people directly in danger. We can deploy to remote areas very quickly, obviously, with helicopter. And we can do it with a lot less resources than we traditionally use in avalanche rescue. We can do it with a minimum of 2 people. Of course, you always want more, but we can do it with very few people. Some disadvantages, it's weather dependent. You can't always fly a helicopter on the days that people are in need of rescue. And with aviation operations, there's always some inherent risk, right? There's never truly zero risk. We do need a trained pilot. We do need a trained pilot to self-deploy. So we have used it in cases where we have used untrained pilots, and that takes a trained rescuer to guide the pilot through the search techniques. But it really works most effectively when we're using it with trained pilots. And we'll get into some aircraft-specific setup, but it does take time pre-season to actually figure out how this works with each aircraft and what the interferences can be. And the biggest point here to stress is that, again, we're not putting people on the ground in dangerous way to search the slide paths. And we have a few instances of how we've used that before. So a little background, this is straight out of all the beacon manuals. This is what the manufacturers state the stated battery life is in a transceiver, and there's lots of caveats here, right? This is if the batteries in the beacons were inserted brand new, 100% when they went in, and this is the estimated amount of time that the beacon will transmit in transmit mode. So there's variations all over the board, but really it's around 250 hours usually is that expected life cycle, and that's if everything's perfect. And there's lots of ways it's not perfect, right? If it's cold, if they weren't 100%, if there's any corrosion in the terminals, there's lots of factors. We're not going to get into why all that matters, but what's important is that we only have a limited amount of time to use this device to find the person we're looking for. Some things that I always talk about when I am talking about batteries and transceivers, it's more of an issue with the Mammoth Pulse beacons that use battery posts instead of springs. With today's manufacturing on batteries, there's often this wrapper, the tag on the battery that wraps around it, and sometimes it can cover the negative terminal on your battery. So I encourage everybody, when you're putting your batteries in your beacons, take a look at that. If any of that plastic wrapper is over the terminal, that can cause your beacon problems, right? I've had it happen where I've put the batteries in, turned it on, didn't hear the startup sequence, took the batteries out, moved them around a little bit, and then it starts up. So something's interfering with that contact. I'm not going to get into all the pros and cons for different types of beacons, but just be aware of that. So the long-range receiver was purchased by AEL&P, our local power utility in Juneau, and we store this device in the winter at coastal helicopters. AEL&P uses it for other missions. When they're doing control work, they take it with them, but normally it's stored at coastal in the event that we have a rescue. If there is an avalanche anywhere near Juneau that somebody calls and requests for help, that all search and rescue is managed by the troopers. And if the long-range receiver is requested, we can take that and use that for missions, and could even be statewide. The setup of the device is usually less than 10 minutes for a trained pilot, so it's pretty quick. And if we're in a real hurry and we don't have that 10 minutes to set up, it can be done in flight. There's nothing that, all this stuff is pre-configured beforehand, so we can do that in flight. So what does it normally look like? This is the perfect response, right? Everything goes right. This is what would typically happen. We get alerted to a avalanche in the backcountry with the possibility of people caught or buried, right? In that time, the rescue team responds to the accident scene, or responds to the airport, or picks up the rescuers from the ski hill, whatever that may be in Juneau, and then deploys from that point. We fly to the scene, we deploy the antenna, we do setup along the way, go into a core search. If we acquire a signal, then we go into find search. Can deploy markers from the aircraft to mark those beacons that we're finding, and then deploy ground resources if it's deemed safe or necessary, or how we want to proceed with the rescue. There's lots of caveats there. We could spend all day talking about when it's best to deploy and when not, so we won't get into that. And then once we clear the entire path, we can retrieve it and return to base, or whatever the next steps may be. Now, you heard a little bit about stress and how that affects decision making and everything else. So the last couple of years, we've developed this very extensive checklist with photos and everything else of how to set it up so that when that stressful time comes, we can look at this checklist with pictures, how to plug everything in, how to test it, and how it all works. That was very beneficial in a rescue that we had in March of this year. We used that extensively. Each type of aircraft is a little bit different. So even though we have 5 or 6 A-stars sitting on the tarmac in Juneau, each one is a little bit different as far as the avionics and everything else. So it's really important to know this device inside and out and how it interacts with each aircraft before we go out. How it's anchored into the system, it's actually pretty easy. We just have a simple carabiner or D-link that's connected to a seatbelt anchor, and then it is deployed outside of the skids and below the aircraft. And there's on the bottom photo there, let's see if I can find the laser pointer. There is a a quick release mechanism that in the event that the antenna was snagged on something, it would be separated from the aircraft. And we just need to make sure that's outside the doors, right? If it's inside, we're in trouble. But there's many different ways to do this. This is just how we do it on one aircraft. Of course, every aircraft's different. We've used different types of anchors, even as simple as handholds and anything else in different aircraft to anchor that to. The biggest problem that we run into with this device is noise. We do system checks while we're en route to make sure that everything's functioning, but this device, for many of you know, just like any other beacon, receives interference from things like cell phones, radios, any kind of electronic device. So in that checklist, are all the phones turned off that are in the helicopter? We actually have started a protocol where any outside radio traffic is either monitored on a handheld or somebody on the ground, so that when we're searching, the helicopter is a quiet space. Those signals that you hear can be quite faint, and if you miss that, you may not find the beacon. So we're trying to eliminate any possibility of interference. Some things that do cause interference that can be a little bit controversial turning off are things like the satellite tracker, the ground-based radar, and other radio frequencies. So sat trackers, a lot of times, companies aren't willing to turn off the satellite tracker on an aircraft, right? At that point, we're flight following locally. The only people that know where we are and what we're doing are the people on scene. And if we're in a remote area, that might only be the person in the helicopter. So if something did happen, that's a problem. So we have to weigh those risks of how we want to manage that. The ground-based radar, that's used to tell pilots how far they are off the ground. Even though this sling and the antenna we're using is fairly short, a lot of it's just based on visual clues and pilot experience of how he can manage that device. And of course, like I've been saying a couple times already, every aircraft is different, and we'll talk about, in a minute here, we'll talk about how we manage that in different aircraft. So what does it look like when we're actually doing it? When we fly to the scene, we start the course search, we're turning the transceiver to the highest possible setting, right? Just like any other beacon search, you're in your course search mode. For this device, we're using 150 meter search strip widths. A typical beacon search strip width is around 50 meters, right? So we can search much larger areas quite quickly. We're flying about 50 feet above ground level and 7 knots forward speed. So we're actually flying pretty low and slow, which is in the danger curve, right? Talking about inherent risks. So low and slow, searching for signals, and we're literally just flying a grid like you're beacon searching on the ground. And of course, this is ideal conditions. We don't often get 150 meter search strip width, or the true 70 to 100 meter range on it. And if that's a problem, if we're doing our testing at the airport or anything else, we just need to modify our search tactics to that new range, right? And again, just a representation as how we're doing it. We're just making sure we're covering all the ground below the aircraft. So I've got a bunch of videos here on us actually using the device, and some of the videos, the quality is not the greatest. It's what we have right now. This is something we've developed in the last year and a half, 2 years, so we'll get more video in the future, but right now this is what we have. This was a training mission that we were doing in Juneau. Just start the video here. And this is an example of course search, and I'll play it through and then I'll point out a couple things.
Is that approximately 7 knots?
7 knots.
I mean, that's the best speed. I get a lower speed, it sounds good.
And really why we're flying so slow, you'll see here in other videos, this one's pretty good, but that antenna is fairly light and it just gets blown around when you're flying too fast. And that just interferes more. Of course, I turn the sound off in these videos. Nobody really wants to hear the helicopter, making a bunch of noise. So in this, we talked about coarse search. In this video, they're actually starting the fine search now, where they've acquired a signal and starting to pinpoint, and we'll get into that here in a minute.
How far is that transceiver above the ground?
Right now, he's fairly close to the ground, probably within 10 to 15 feet as he pinpoints, but typically we're trying to fly at that about 50-foot level, which puts the antenna 35 to 40 feet. You know, it's all relative. The line itself is not that long.
How do you know where you are on the traffic? Judgment?
Judgment. Yeah. And we typically record all these search tracks so we can go back later and see how our coverage was, but okay, we'll get into the rest here in a minute. Don't need to play it twice. So, now I talked about 150 meter search strip width. If we're searching terrain traps or gullies or crevasses, we don't need to do 150 meter search strip width, right? We can fly those features independently and make sure that we have good coverage. So like in this photo, flying the gully that runs down the center of the photo would be perfectly acceptable, and that's what we did when we were up in Hatcher Pass here a few years ago. So the area that we were searching was this gully, so we didn't have to search the area around it. We've already searched that in other subsequent searches.
So from the searcher perspective, it's just analog, you're just listening?
Yeah, it's just analog. And for those that haven't practiced with an analog beacon in a few years, I mean, it's still the technology we're using here. It's still quite effective, but it is a skill. It's something you really have to practice. And getting that across to pilots, we find is easier for those that have the backcountry skiing experience, that have used an Avalanche transceiver in the past. Otherwise, it's us in the back seat telling the pilot, no, that's a signal, let's back up.
Does the pilot hear the analog signal as well?
Yeah, so this is all plugged in through the ICS system, so everybody in the aircraft can hear it. But we put push-to-talks and everything on all of the headsets so somebody can't override that signal. That's what's live the whole time, is this signal. And that's why the interference is brought to a minimum. You really want to hear, I mean, it's quite loud when you actually start pinpointing and get to it, but that first recognition that there is a signal can often be quite faint.
And do you ever have to deploy any kind of visual markers on your search path to be able to get your depth perception?
Yeah, so this wasn't quite obvious in this video, but sometimes it's quite flat light when you're doing this, right? So usually the debris adds a little bit of texture to the snow, but sometimes it is hard for the pilots to really figure out where that snow surface is. And that's the case where is it really worth us being in the helicopter searching when there's, you know, inherent danger of flying in those conditions. I don't have all the answers for that. We're still figuring that out. So fine search is just like with your transceivers. It's when you acquire a signal and you have to pinpoint where it is. The same as what we're doing in rescue basics and AVI classes, right? We're finding the signal, we're pinpointing, and we're moving into it. Now we found that the transceiver itself is capable of doing finer searching than what's truly feasible to do from the aircraft, right? So as we get a signal, we start turning down the range on the transceiver and really starting to fine tune that grid of where that transceiver that's buried is. And we've done this a bunch of training. You know, we've tried to go from the highest range all the way down to the lowest range and really figure out and pinpoint where that beacon is. But realistically, this is a good course search tool. And if you're really pinpointing and trying to find exactly where they are, that's where your ground resources are much faster. So we've set our own rule that we're not going past mid-level on the device. So we're using it to get close, and then we know that we deploy a marker, and that's when we use our traditional methods to find the person. So I have a good video of that here. Same day, another training mission in Juneau. So at this point, they've acquired a signal, they're starting the fine search, so you can see that they've slowed way down, they're barely even moving forward at this point, and they're moving side to side, upslope and downslope, following that signal to figure out exactly where it is.
Does digital technology exist in these long-range receivers at this point?
No.
Is anyone working on that? Or is there, I mean, do you see benefit in having digital at some point?
Usually the range in an analog device is more than a digital device. I'm sure the technology will get us there eventually. They just released a new transceiver to put in the aircraft. I think we're going to purchase one here in the next couple weeks that has some digital type readouts. It's still not going to give you a true range and direction. That's still going to be based on analog tones. And in this case, there's actually two buried targets, and you'll see them deploy two different markers. Now, doing multiple burials from the helicopter adds another layer of complexity there, right? It's not a single, that takes some recognition from the searchers in the aircraft or the pilot that there's multiple signals here. You know, you can hear multiple beeps. And how are we going to manage that? Are we just going to throw two markers out the window and then land and send people out to figure it out? Or are we going to spend the time trying to differentiate in the helicopter? And those are all decisions that have to be made for each case, right? I'm not going to tell you there's an answer for that. Every time it's different. So should see there, just deployed a marker there, and then they'll continue searching on. Now for this scenario, there's deployed the second marker there. For this scenario, we determined that it was okay to put resources on the ground. So here's the helicopter is still, I mean, they're hovering overhead. You'll see them deploy the antenna to keep searching, but now we have ground-based resources working at the same time that the helicopter's working. Now we can divide even farther and continue to search the slope with more resources.
Have those ground-based resources, do they come out of the helicopter?
Yep. So for this case, Mike and I there on the slope were in the helicopter. There's still two more in the helicopter that they could deploy two more if needed. And in this scenario, there was three buried beacons, and it's a little bit different that we're all standing at the helicopter base waiting for the call, right? That never happens. But in this case, we had 3 subjects buried. It took 12 minutes from the time we got the call to get to the scene and mark all 3 beacons. It's about a 5 to 7 minute flight time from the airport, so we found the 3 beacons within the first 5 to 10 minutes, right? That's pretty good. It took 24 minutes from the time that we got the call to extract all 3. I mean, this is a scenario, right? So we're not extracting people, but still, that's pretty quick. That's promising. We can use this tool. And we were really impressed with how close we were able to get. All of the markers were within a meter of where the beacons were. So that's promising. So how we've actually used it is we've used it in Hatcher Pass in 2015, and then we used it last March in Ketchikan on Dude Mountain. And I'll talk more about Ketchikan here. So 2 snowboarders caught in an avalanche on the northwest aspect of Dude Mountain near Ketchikan on February 25th of this year. There was one rider, both were caught, but one was able to self-arrest and start companion rescue. Was unable to locate ski partners, so they called EMS and started the rescue system. The Ketchikan Volunteer Rescue Squad was unable to reach the site due to adverse weather conditions and high avalanche danger, right? That's something we hear all the time. We can't get there. So something in particular about this specific slide path is it terminates in a 300-foot cliff. So putting resources out on that slope is just not feasible. We're not going to put somebody out there with avalanche danger to go search that slope when if something were to happen, they're going to get swept over the cliff. So we were requested to come down and use the long-range receiver. So weather on scene when we got there on March 1st was overcast, gusts as high as 50 miles an hour. We're familiar with the A-Star and how it operates. The pilots down there are more familiar with Hughes 500s. So those who know that as a smaller aircraft. a little more capable in tight trees and stuff like this, and the pilots were more comfortable with it. So they said, let's use the Hughes 500. Well, for us, we have to take another moment and kind of reconfigure the whole system at that point. It's okay. We adapted, did our range checks, and we found that for whatever reason, some kind of avionics in this aircraft decreased our range from 70 meters down to 40 meters. So now we have to just change our search trip width to reflect that. It's not a big deal. And of course, there's evidence of multiple avalanches on all nearby slopes. We started the core search, and we acquired a signal within the first 5 minutes of searching. So we were able to use this tool successfully. We deployed markers and then tried to figure out what was going on the ground. And just as people are wondering about that event, we get these, the last couple years, we've seen more and more of these events where we have rain on snow, we form this melt freeze crust or whatever other process forms a melt freeze crust within the snowpack. We get cold and clear for a long period of time, and then we get cold, dry snow, and we get near surface faceting starting, right? This happened a lot to us the last couple years. And then we just get snow on top of it, and it becomes our weak layer. Picture of the snow pit of the day we were there, showing the near surface facets and the slab that was there. One little video of Mike doing a propagation saw test, because everybody likes to see tests, right? Of what the conditions were on the day that we were there with a long range receiver. So that was a PST of 40. So we came back, we looked at everything that happened, and we were, other than the outcome, we were all very excited about this opportunity. We've trained with this for years, and now we're able to use it. The burial depth on this rescue was 1.3 meters, and our marker was within a meter of that tree. So this is an effective tool that we can use. Some other exciting things that we have going on down in Juneau is we're working on an airborne RECO capability as well. We can search with RECO from the aircraft, and we used that this March on another rescue. So as far as we know, that's the first time it's been used in Alaska and the second time in the US. And along with that, we're also working with the military to use this. So when we do have adverse weather conditions, when we can't fly in commercial aircraft, we can fly with the Coast Guard in IFR conditions or with the National Guard. And that comes, for those that know RECO, that comes with a whole other host of problems operating from military aircraft. There's so much interference in these aircraft that it's hard to use, but we think we figured out a way to use it. We're working with RECO on that, and that's a pretty exciting step for us in Southeast. And that's all I have. Are there any questions? Nothing? Yeah.
Maybe you said this, but did you try weighting the transceiver with?
Yeah, we've tried a couple different things. We really haven't come up with a good solution on how to weight that. And it's actually okay if it's moving around a little bit. That's just kind of like when you're using your analog beacon to kind of turn and catch any of those signals, right? We haven't found it to be that detrimental. What is a problem, if we're too low to the ground and there's blowing dry snow, the static interference from that's heard through the whole system, and it's almost deafening. It like takes over everything. It's like, that is a problem. But
Is there any way you can get the transceiver lower to the ground, like more distant from the aircraft? Or?
you could potentially. We haven't used that yet. This is all, these tools have only been developed in the last couple years, and we're still fine tuning it, but could be an option, but weight would be more of an issue in that case for the pilot flying that device.
Do you see it?
see this as like a real applicable rescue tool or more of a plotter recovery tool?
No, it's definitely a tool that we could use, especially if it's it's at the airport, ready to go on an aircraft that's staged for rescue. It's really going to take the pilot kind of self-deploying and picking up resources on the way. A place like Juneau, we have a bunch of ski patrollers on staff usually, and Brian's usually gracious enough to let somebody go during the middle of the day. But they can fly to the ski hill, pick people up that are already ready for rescue, and then deploy on the way. So we're pretty excited about that opportunity.
Along with last mile rescue, I think another scenario that's happened with some frequency is you notice an incident, you can get a pinpoint on the location before the storm hits and buries it. Because often we're going back in days later and having to put a lot of resources into that. This tool allows us to at least get a position mark, potentially GPS, and then go back into the recovery when conditions are safer.
And if people were caught by the slide, not necessarily buried but injured, this could be a way that we could find them quickly, potentially, land, tow in landing, pull them into the aircraft and get out of there without putting anyone on the ground, putting anyone in danger. Very short period of time. That's a risk that a lot of other factors there, but there are potential for other survival scenarios. Mike.
I just wanted to add, there is one known documented case of live recovery with this. It's in Europe, but helicopter with a hoist, insert the alarm, receiver, drop the rescue down, and live recovery. So we say it's common, but the stars align and the helicopter crew is ready, and there's people that are during that initial response time to get common.
Anything else? Thank you.